Welcome back to segment 4 for this week's Community and Independent Living lesson. In this segment, we're going to talk about barriers to living in the community. And please understand, I'm not pointing fingers at any one person or individual, because it really is a very, very broad kind of a concern and broad issue, if you will. And we'll think about it in terms of there are systemic issues, there are attitudinal issues, and from my standpoint, we're going to talk about healthcare issues as well. And when we think about the systemic issues here, we're really talking about the idea that, at least at this point, by and large in the United States, the money that's designated to help people with disabilities, particularly their living, flows to institutions, flows to nursing homes, but it doesn't flow to the individual. And so if it doesn't come to the individual, then he or she has no control over how to use that, support themselves, develop the appropriate kinds of things that they would need. It's not there. So our money, taxpayer money, goes to supporting institutions and nursing homes far, far more than it goes to the individual to help him or her exist in the community. Which is an unfortunate thing because, again, I mentioned the ADA, 1990, was recently reauthorized a couple years ago, but there's a Supreme Court decision called the Olmstead decision. Again, I would encourage you to look at that. But, in quick summary, it was a decision that was reached where it said, the justices said, states have to come up with ways of providing options for people so that they're not just necessarily going into institutions, but they have options. Again, that was 1990. It's 2013, and there are still many states, including the one that I live in here in Illinois, where we do a very poor job at this point of providing those options. Should mention, as I was just talking about, that institutions and nursing homes have great influence, great power. It's part of how the world works. Money controls things, money equals power, and the lobbies that exist for nursing homes, for institutions, they have great sway over the decisions that get reached. Individuals, families who are dealing with this, on a personal level, don't have nearly that power, that clout to make change. The research that's been done on this topic would say that by and large, for those individuals with disabilities, it's cheaper as taxpayers for us to support them in the community than it is to maintain institutions. So it's kind of this conundrum. It's a chicken and an egg problem. It's like we have all these institutions, all these nursing homes. You have people who want out. We want to set things up in the community, but there needs to be supports in the community. So how do we get them from those nursing homes and institutions into the community if most of the money is still flowing to those group settings? One of the major challenges to living in the community, especially for people with mobility impairments, relates to physical access. Let's hear what Dale Spencer has to say about this.
Thoughts about accommodations when it comes to my disability. I consider myself low maintenance. My injury is quite low. I'm under my hips. My T12 is the one that broke. So the section of the spinal cord, there's actually 3 sections. There's cervical, thoracic, and lumbar. Now the thoracic level has 12 bones. Mine was the 12th bone, which means right under my hips on down are affected. Reason I explain that is because there are some needs that I have, and there's 2 of them. So to get into a building, I need to have a ramp. Number 2, I need to have bathroom accommodations. Not only a door that is wide enough to open into the bathroom, but the wheelchair accessible stall. Not only enough room for the toilet, but also enough room for the wheelchair to accommodate me. I feel lucky that I'm in the Chicagoland area because we're in a metropolitan area that is really excellent when it comes to accessibility as opposed to many other small towns. So give me an example. I wasn't doing a lecture in Birmingham last October. I had to stay in my hotel the whole time because there was no sidewalks to even get and stop lights to get across the street to go to a restaurant that I really wanted to go to. I had to be shuttled over there because they didn't have the sidewalk. They just had a street, and that's it. So yes, I think as citizens that we need to understand that people with disabilities not only stay in their house and stay in their own little section of the city, we like to travel too. And that's a good thing too. So that's a huge societal barrier, I think.
Another barrier that we face is attitudinal. And we've talked about attitudes throughout, so I won't take a lot of time on this. But I do want to mention a very interesting study that's one of your readings today. And it was a study that was conducted by the U.S. Housing and Urban Development. And what they did was done in Chicago, interestingly. they made phone calls to people who were renting apartments, to landlords. And in one condition, they called up and said they used wheelchairs. In another condition, they called up through a relay service because they were deaf. And in the third condition, they just called up as anyone else and did not mention disability. What do you think the results were? Do you think there was any difference in terms of how landlords responded? I'm hoping that you guessed yes, because what they found in this study is that people who were in this, who portrayed themselves either deaf or as wheelchair users, experienced greater levels of discrimination. We're told about fewer apartments, were given misinformation, far more than any other group that Housing and Urban Development had studied before. So even race-based, if you would, people of different races, ethnicities, did not face the same level of discrimination that people with disabilities had. So that's a very significant, in my opinion, identification of attitudinal barriers. So then the third barrier has to do with healthcare access. And this is one where it's huge. How can you live in the community without having healthcare? And yet, for many individuals with disabilities, people who are poor, Medicaid is their only option. And yet, for those of you who may not be aware of this, and I will say I was equally ignorant, not every doctor takes Medicaid. So I mentioned that I had my brother come and live with me for a while before I was able to get him placed. I live in a town that is reasonably nice suburb, and there was no one within a half an hour of my home, no doctor, that would accept my brother's Medicaid when we finally got that established. So we had to go elsewhere and get it, and so being an advocate and looking out after healthcare is a huge issue. And I've got a couple of guest speakers who I'd like to also have them share their perspectives on the importance of healthcare and living in the community.
The first thing they want to do is cure it. And I'm sorry, you're not going to cure autism. I'm sorry. All right? And because they always think they're sick, and that's their mindset. A lot of them. They have a disability. There's a difference between curing something and a treatment plan. That's two different things. And they have to think of treatment, and they have to mold it as an individual, because if you...
I would suggest that doctors be understanding of other deaf people and that they need interpreters sometimes. That a piece of paper simply just won't do in some situations.
I think it's important for everyone to understand that healthcare providers don't just start when you are in the little room, in the little cubicle waiting for the doctor to knock on the door. It starts really way before that. For instance, when you're at a provider's office and someone in the office staff lets it be known that they're not particularly fond of you being there, or otherwise might be rude or inconsiderate. I mean, that goes a long way to defining how a patient or someone cared for in a clinic setting might feel about this whole situation. The doctor or the provider, him or herself, may be wonderful, but if the front office staff and the support staff aren't on board with the whole program, then it's not necessarily a positive situation. So that being said, doctors need to make sure that there's zero tolerance for people who are rude or insubordinate. With regards to my own experience and how I was initially diagnosed or informed of the diagnosis, it was quite disconcerting. I did have a lot of confidence in the provider as we were going through several tests to try and determine what was wrong with me. This is the initial diagnosis. And when it came to the point where he had figured out what was wrong, and it came time for him to communicate that to me, that's where the real problem lied. Not in what the diagnosis was or finding it, but in communicating it. And I'll never forget how it was done. Frankly, I was in that cubicle sitting, waiting for the doctor to knock on the door, and he did. And he came in and he said, "Mr. Harris, thousands of times each day, bad things happen to good people. Today, it's your turn." That was in itself a bit disconcerting. Then he proceeded to say, "Here's the diagnosis." And he took, I'll remember, a pen from his pocket with the little plastic nerd pocket protector. I always like to say that. And he took the pen, which was red ink, and wrote on a piece of paper silently the diagnosis and showed it to me and crumpled it up and threw it away. that was even more disconcerting. And then the first things he said was, give me 5 minutes, I'll be right back. And let me sit there for what seemed like 5 hours, not 5 minutes. That also was disconcerting. And lastly, when he came back into the room, finally, he said, Mr. Harris, I find God to be very forgiving. That was the last thing I heard him say. He may have talked 10 more minutes after that, but I heard nothing else of what he had to say. So it wasn't, I didn't feel like a discrimination type issue as much as a communication type issue. And that can affect people in real ways. It did affect me because it took another 6 months or so before I actually sought out care from a provider.
I've found through all my experience, you need to be your own healthcare advocate. You know, whether it's insurance or doctors, you know, I've had neurologists who, despite what I'm telling them the medicine is doing to my body, they think it's okay. Well, that's, you know, you're the one taking it, so you should decide whether or not it's good for you. I've also, you know, having to go to the ER, you know, and I have a seizure in the ER and nobody seems to care because I'm there for, you know, a CAT scan for my brain. It's very, you know, making sure you're very voiced about this is what's wrong, please help me now. You know, I mean, it's not enough to just lay there and expect them to do it. Be your own advocate. Unfortunately, you have to do that even when you have a phenomenal doctor. So you just have to be persistent about it. You know, always say, I know what my body does, and I know how I have seizures, unfortunately, so this is what's going to work for me.
And so, I've heard the guest speakers, and so I'd just like to say in summary before we move on to our next segment that, you know, we've talked about the idea that money flows to institutions far more than it flows to individuals, that attitudes within the public are oftentimes huge barriers in terms of getting people into the community, and that living in the community requires access to health care, requires access to the things that, you know, keep us supported and keep us alive. And that, you know, until we get greater education and greater awareness, these things aren't going to change. So as we end this segment, I just wanted to let you know as we move on to segment number 5, that in segment number 5 we'll take a bit more positive view of things and talk about supports, strategies, and solutions.